Hello, everyone. I'm Bradley Englert, a senior editor here at Orbit. I'm so glad that you all were able to join us today for our session on how to write your first SFF novel. It's the beginning of NaNoWriMo, so happy beginning of that for everyone who's participating. We have a really great panel of authors with us today, but before I jump into that, I just want to go over a little bit of how to use Crowdcast if you've never used it before. So there's a green button at the bottom that will link you to all of our wonderful authors' books, and it will also let you look at the other sessions that we've had going on. If you need to jump out for any reason, or if you really love how this conversation went and you want to share with your friends, you can click that link and share with your friends. You can rewatch it at any time. On the sidebar, there's a chat function, but the more important part is the Q&A function. So if you have any questions for our panel, you can put it in there, and then you can vote on the ones that you like. And the ones that go to the top are the ones that we'll sort of see and be very easy for us to access and answer. And then, yeah, the replay is available after the event. So for the first sort of 30-ish minutes, we'll run through some questions that we've prepared. And then after that, we'll jump into the Q&A. So I'll do a quick introduction of all of our authors very quickly. So we have Evan Winter, who is the author of the epic fantasy novels The Rage of Dragons and The Fires of Vengeance. Andrea Stewart is the author of the Drowning Empire series, which starts with the Bone Shard Daughter. M.A. Carrick is the joint pen name of Marie Brennan and Alice Helms, authors of the Rook and Rose trilogy, which begins with The Mask of Mirrors. And Gareth Hanrahan is the author of the Black Iron Legacy series, beginning with The Gutter Prayer, and his new series, Lands of the Firstborn, begins with The Sword Defiant. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited about this conversation. So I'll actually just jump in, and first, can you give us a quick pitch of your book or series and a brief overview of the magic system? Because that's what we're here to discuss today, is developing magic systems and all of this sort of, is it a hard magic system? Is it a soft magic system? Is it I make it up as I go along based off of what the story needs magic system? So I'll start with Evan, actually. Could you just go ahead and jump in and give us a quick pitch?
Thank you. How did I know I was going to be first? Oh no. My first book in my series is The Rage of Dragons, and it's typically pitched as Game of Thrones meets Gladiator. Here it also kind of has very big revenge kind of themes, so sort of like Count of Monte Cristo, if that's sort of more familiar for people. In terms of the magic system in the series, it is, I think of it as being a bit more hard, although maybe a hard magic system, although maybe some readers would disagree. But it definitely has rules that I've sort of that I try very hard to abide by. There's a strong structure for how things work and what can happen and what can't happen. And the way it sort of all happens is that there are two realms. There's the realm where most of the characters live, and there's the realm that is more magical. And the magic users in the series can pull magic from the magic realm and then use it in the world where most of the characters tend to live and exist for most of the time. So yeah, that's the story about the magic system.
Awesome, thank you. And then I'll kick it over to Gareth.
I shall unmute myself by the power of sorcery. Hey, I'll, because I could babble for a billion years about magic systems, because with my other hat, I do role-playing games, I'll just concentrate on the Lands of the Firstborn, which is the setting for The Sword Defiant. There are basically two major magic systems in that. There is Star Magic, which is the magic the elves use, because it's very old-school D&D-esque inspired, which is basically all about you prepare spells in advance. It's all based on constellations, on basically drawing power from the stars. To cast a spell, you know which stars are in ascendancy and the horoscope of the person trying to cast the spell on. And it's all deliberately overcomplicated and formal and tricky. And elves can do it naturally. Humans have to spend years and years studying. It's relatively hard for anyone to accomplish much with it. And the other magic system is the earth power, which is very much the human system, and saying system there is an exaggeration because it is much more instinctual, much more basically drawing up power from the living earth and trying to channel it. And the practitioners there are more sort of mystics who don't really understand what they're doing or how they're doing it, but just comes naturally to them. And basically set up a contrast between the two different cultures. And that's that.
Awesome, thank you. And then I'll kick it over to Alyssa.
Hi there, everyone. I am the co-author with Marie Brennan of the Rook and Rose trilogy, and it's a Venetian-inspired political fantasy. It's got con artists and capers and rooftop vigilantes and ruthless crime lords. And it kind of has those vibes. It centers around a woman named, well, she's got a lot of names, but we'll call her Wren, who decides to infiltrate a noble house to secure a fortune for herself and her sister. And it kind of launches from there and gets much more in depth in the conflicts between these cultures in the city. And so we've got these two clashing cultures and actually three magic systems. Numenatria is the more rules-based, logic-based system of the ruling class, the Leganti, and it's based on real-world numerology and sacred geometry, and it's used to channel energy. So it's got a very set things that it can do. And then Pattern is a divinatory system using card readings, much like real-world tarot, and that's the magic system used by the Fresenians, who are the indigenous people of this colonized city. And then there's imbuing, which is the redheaded stepchild. It's the art of crafting things to work better by reaching the state of flow and literally putting your own energy into it. And so these three underlying magic systems, they come from the same source and they follow the same logic structure, but culturally they end up being very different and used for different things in different ways, and reflecting the cultures of the people who use them. So yeah, that's what we've got.
Then my camera has disappeared, but I'll kick it over to Andrea.
Yeah, so mine is the Drowning Empire series. It starts with the Bone Shard Daughter, and it's an epic fantasy in an Asian-inspired setting on an archipelago of migratory islands under the backdrop of a brewing revolution. So that's kind of like the basics. The magic system, there's actually two main magic systems. So one is a hard magic system, and one is a soft magic system. The soft magic system is kind of an elemental magic. So there's water, air, earth. And then the other one is a hard magic system, which consists of writing commands onto shards of bone from living people and putting these into constructs that are made up of different animals. And it powers them and also tells them what they can and cannot do.
Great. Cool. So I'll just go right into my first question, which is magic systems and fantasy novels exist on somewhat of a spectrum, as I alluded to earlier. So from rule-bound and almost scientific at one end to more sort of nebulous and mysterious at the other. So where on that magic system would you say, where on that spectrum would you say your magic system falls? And I'll start with Gareth for this one.
Yeah, I mean, sort of consciously, I've got two magic systems, one at each end of the spectrum, just like, for the simple starting model. Yeah, in both cases, one is a very sort of in-world hard system, one is sort of in-world soft. In both cases, my actual understanding of them and how they work in the plot, because the main character is this fairly dumb fighter, he's fairly hazy on how all of them work. So I also haven't had to really nail down the complexities of the really hard one, because what happens is he asks the question and the wizard character gives him a paragraph of technobabble and he goes, okay, who do I hit?
I like that. And then I'll go to Marie for your magic system.
So if we had a little more time, I would argue with this hard-soft kind of spectrum thing that everybody kind of takes for granted, but we don't. All of our systems, they depend on kind of an underlying symbolic logic, and the thing about symbols is they are slippery, that they don't just mean the one set thing, and that's what makes them powerful. So Numenatria looks like the much harder one because it is based around numbers and geometry, and there's much more clear rules for draw this geometric figure and X will happen. But what the geometric figure does is still dependent on, well, we associate the number 5 with power and with health, and so it can do a variety of things based on our symbolic associations. But it does look and is a bit more rigorous than Pattern, which people in our setting who study and practice Numenatria rip their hair out when they look at Pattern, because they're like, it just sounds like you're making things up. Like, how is there any kind of rules or system to this? And yet it does follow its own underlying logic, so they are a bit on that spectrum, but I also would argue with the underlying question.
That's fair. I think when you get into magic systems with writers, there's a lot of arguments to be had. All right, I'll go to Andrea next.
I'm definitely one of those terrible people where I don't like to make decisions, so I'm like, why not both? so so one is like definitely I would classify it as more of a soft magic system where the power that they use, it takes energy and it takes skill, but there's no like hard definitions. And the other one I would say is more of a hard magic system where I basically like to look at some kind of scientific concept and like I'm like why not make it magic? So so it's a little bit like having like robots and computer programming, but with flesh and bones. Um, and I think, like Marie said, there's an argument to be made, though, about how hard a magic system is because it is based on language and language is fallible. So there are always like loopholes or like little mistakes that people make. So yeah, that's like how I classify mine. Like I would say there's one hard magic system and one soft magic system.
Great. And then Evan, how would you classify yours?
Yeah, I think that mine is probably, at least in my own mind, it's probably a little bit harder, but only in so much as when I'm reading books or when I'm consuming any sort of media or storytelling, I really enjoy it when I can understand the limits of what's possible within each moment, each scene, within each chapter or book in its entirety. So I wanted that to be the case. I wanted anybody who's reading this to understand what's possible and what's not possible almost at every single moment, because I think for me, it helps set up the stakes. It helps set up the ideas of how people can achieve their goals or lose their goals. And then it offers opportunities for creating sort of not necessarily just twists like a narrative twist, but offers opportunities for creating a surprise moment or an interesting moment where people use the things that you understand in a way you didn't expect. And so that's the stuff that I really enjoy when I'm reading. And it's the stuff that I connect to more. So that was the kind of magic system I tried to work with.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think I'm basing everything around how does this affect the character, really more than even how it affects the world. You come at it from a character level. I think that's the most interesting way to approach any magic system. Sort of how does that flesh them out and make them interesting to you? Cool. So what I want to do next actually is a lightning round of logistical questions about magic in your books. So answer these as briefly as you can. And Evan, I apologize, but I think we all have the same screen set up. So you're going to be first for me on all of these. And then let's just rotate clockwise and just jump in as soon as the person before you is done. So my first lightning round question is, what degree of effect can magic have on the world? Can it physically bring down mountains, or is it more of a matter of slightly shifting the probabilities? So we'll start with you, Evan, and then we'll circle around.
Yeah, good question. The answer, in as short as I can say it, is that it cannot bring down mountains necessarily for most people, but it can greatly affect outcomes, and it depends on who is using it and how they're doing it.
Gareth, you want to go next?
Sure. I've written the third book at the moment, but in books 1 and 2, I've actually thinking about it, I've taken out a mountain in each one, and it was different people taking out the mountains. And in one case, it was this absurdly powerful Earth power user basically showing off, saying, "This is how I'm like the most powerful Earth power user ever," because she's literally death incarnate, blow up a mountain. And in book 2, it was this wizard who was using the much more formal, sort of technical star magic, using that to basically take control of this weather control magic mountain and basically turn it on itself and zap it with its own lightning bolts over and over and over until it was rubble. So technically mountains, but in very, very specific cases. I don't think I'm killing a mountain in book 3, but I have like 50,000 words left to go, so we shall see.
There's still time.
There's still time, and there's still mountains.
Great. Ellis?
I think, Marie, you were going to take this one, right?
I'm going to leave this one, so I'll confuse the order. None of ours are on the scale where you could pull down like a mountain. Numenatria is much usually better at making blatant obvious effects like explosions and such, but depending on circumstances, pattern can also do some dramatic things too.
Okay, so most of it's going to be kind of smaller, I think, but I think with mine, definitely you have the right circumstances and knowledge, you can bring down mountain.
Okay, so what is the source of magic? Is it internal or external? Is it renewable? Is it non-renewable? How does where does the magic come from in your world? And we'll start with you again, Evan.
Okay, yeah, I would say it is external and renewable, and it comes from a secondary realm that the people that we're following have access to in special circumstances, and also with heavy costs.
Gareth, you're up next.
Star magic comes from the stars. Earth magic comes from the earth. There we go. Tick.
Alice and Marie.
So Numenatria and Pattern both come from the gods associated with them. So Numenatria from the Lumen, which is this kind of light godhead, and Pattern from Azurites, who is the goddess of the Versenian people. And imbuing actually comes from your personal energy. And so if you're using Pattern or Numenatria, you're drawing on a god's energy. If you're using imbuing, you're drawing from your own personal energy. But if you do something like, say, imbuing a Numenat, you're replacing your energy instead of using the gods. And so that can quickly like drain you and kill you, which is a danger. So we kind of play with that idea of like just gods have more energy and the person, not so much.
So the soft magic system, the source of that is internal. And the hard magic system with the bone shards, the source of that is the life force of other people, basically, that you're taking the bones from.
All right, and then how does a magic user invoke the magic? Is it a spoken spell, a waved wand, a mental state, taking someone's bones? And we'll start with you again, Evan.
No worries. For me, it's they cast their spirit into an underworld. And the underworld has beings that exist there who typically do not like you being there. And so that's sort of the conflict with trying to use magic. And the more power you wish to take, the longer you have to be in that underworld, the longer you're in the underworld, the more likely bad things are going to happen to you. So.
And Gareth?
For star magic, if you're an elf, you just do it instinctively. If you're human, there's a lot of mostly off-screen prep and chanting and drawing diagrams and doing technical things. For the earth power, it is, while there is a degree of chanting that is more sort of mental aid and tradition, and it's really just picking up fist of power, going thump at the world.
And Marie and Ellis?
So with Numenatria, you better be prepared to do some very precise geometry because your accuracy and precision affects how effective it is. Imbuing, you get yourself into that state of flow where you're just absorbed in whatever it is that you're making or doing. And Pattern, mostly people think that involves laying cards. Sometimes it involves drug trips and weird things like that.
Soft magical system, you have to be in a certain state of mind and also a bond with a certain kind of creature. For the hard magic system, it's basically this old dead language that you have to learn, and you also have to reach a meditative state of mind in order to the shards into the constructs.
Yeah, so having to sort of learn that language actually leads into my next question, which is, are there limits on who can use the magic? Is there training that's needed? Is it sort of an inborn ability? Is it available to everyone? What are the sort of limits on who can do it? And we'll start again with you, Evan.
Yeah, there appear to be very hard limits in my world, but at the same time, kind of like Marie was saying, the way things are slippery, and the way things appear in the beginning may not be exactly how it is by the time you get to the end.
And Gareth.
Trying to carefully dance around certain spoilers. For star magic, anyone can do it, but elves can do it instinctively. For humans, you've got to be taught. There's only one college that officially teaches it, and people to get to that college need to be sponsored by one of the noble families. So basically, if you either come from a noble family or are sufficiently talented that they will sponsor you and pay for your education, and that you work for them, That's how you get to learn magic. Earth magic, it sort of like randomly people develop a talent for it, or happen to be standing in the wrong place at the wrong time when this flow of earth power comes through a particular valley or whatever. And for most people, they get one spark of it in their lifetime. That's when you have a vision, or you turn to a wolf, or accidentally blight your neighbor's sheep because you're annoyed at them for sneezing at you in the pub last night. But there are people who have a deeper connection to it and who can be trained into how to cultivate that connection and use it more reliably.
I think in the Rick and Rose, similarly, Numenatria is very much requires extensive training. There are scholarly publications and academic arguments that have gone on for generations, and so it's very much its own kind of academic milieu. But anybody can do it if they've got the training. Pattern, it's a lot more has to do with your connection to Azurice, the goddess of the Bressenian people. And there are frauds who do pattern, and there's definitely traditions and training around the practice. But there are also people who are just have an innate ability to do it based on a variety of things that would be spoilery. And then imbuing is really just about your skill in a particular craft. The better you are at something, the more likely you're going to achieve that state of flow, the more likely you're going to be able to imbue something. So yeah, it's all across the board.
For the hard magic system in mine, it is just knowledge based, but that knowledge has been held within the Imperial family. They're basically we're not sharing it. Soft magic system, it's basically anyone that bonds to one of these creatures, and that's generally the creature's choice and not yours.
This is awesome, Andrea. You're doing a great job of sort of leading into my my next questions, which are so how reliable is the magic? If you invoke magic, do you know that it's going to have a certain effect, or is it more unpredictable? Does someone else get to choose for you? So Evan, we'll start with you. Reliability on your magic system.
Yeah, no, and it's very reliable. It's basically, I was going to say it's basically like a science, which I won't say, but well, I just did say that. But anyway, it's pretty reliable. Like when you want to do something, if you know how to do it, it will happen. So yeah, and that way it sort of ideally and hopefully keeps the stakes knowable to the reader.
For me, with the Starbase magic is super reliable if you get it right, but because it involves all these technical preparations and horoscopes and so forth, there are infinite excuses for crap wizards who get it wrong to explain why their spell didn't work. The earth power it's reliable in that something will happen if you invoke it, but what that is really dependent on the skill of the wielder. So it can go horribly wrong and have all sorts of nasty side effects.
For Numenatria, incredibly reliable. Again, like Evan, I don't want to call it a science, but it's kind of like a science. And so it also depends on how well you've executed it, your Numenat, the geometric accuracy of it. Pattern it's wibbly wobbly, timey wimey. It's very much about the slippage of it. It's a divinatory system. It's got that kind of thing going on. And then again, imbuing is just about the skill of the crafter, and you can kind of sort of focus on what you want a thing to do, but it's very much based on whatever you're creating, what those things can do. You can't make a sword create a light, because that's not what swords do. They stab or something.
I'd say the hard magic system in mine is fairly reliable, but it is back to that comparison. It is a bit like computer programming, where you're going to have bugs in the system, or there's going to be loopholes that people can take advantage of. So it really kind of depends on how tightly you write those commands. And then for the soft magic system, I mean, it's fairly reliable, but it's based upon your little critter that you're bonded with. So they do go through phases of hibernation and evolution. So during those phases, you're not going to be able to access that magic.
And then my last of the lightning round questions, which we alluded to this a little bit earlier, but are there any drawbacks or negative side effects to using magic? So are there specific consequences for using magic in your world? And we'll start with you for this last one, Evan.
Yeah, because you have to cast your soul into this underworld, it's vulnerable there, and if the denizens of that environment get you, they will kill you. So the cost is death if you don't know how you're doing, if you don't know how to do what you're doing properly.
For Star Magic, it's fairly consequence free, but the thing is, to cast a spell with it, you need to basically accumulate enough star power, and because elves are accreted naturally, they're fine. But humans have to collect it and basically set up these nets every night and slowly get trickles of it. So if you don't have access to lots of support infrastructure, it could take you like weeks or years to gather enough power for a spell. So you want to get it right. And earth power, if it goes wrong. But I've written an entire chapter of book 2 from the perspective of a crane, because one of the characters accidentally turned herself into a bird and flew off, and basically lost who she was and flew off. So it's a lot of time researching, like, what do cranes do? Because I went, she's a crane. And then what do cranes eat? Where do they fly to?
Alyssa touched before on the fact that imbuing is the most sort of obviously dangerous of ours, because you are putting something of yourself into what you make. And if, for example, you imbue a Numenot, then instead of plugging in a god as the battery for it, you're plugging in yourself, and you're not infinite like a god. But there are also other more subtle ways that things can be dangerous, because Numenatria, for example, because it channels energy, can cause metaphysical things that affect one person to spill out to another if they're connected through Numenatria. So the interplay is where a lot of the danger arises for us.
For the hard magic system in mine, other people bear the burden of that, and that it drains their life force, so they end up like dying bit earlier. Obviously, after a while, if you keep doing that, people might be a bit upset with you. And then the other one is more of a social cost, because due to the history in this world, using the elemental magic is not seen as a great thing.
Okay, so we can spend a little bit more time on this question, because I think it's a little bit of a bigger question, but how central was magic and the magic system to the idea of your book and series? Is it more of background world building, or was it sort of the main conflict? Is the main conflict of your world related to magic? And actually, I'll start with you, Andrea.
Oh, sure. Okay. I would say it's very much the basis for what happens in the world. I mean, I feel like magic is a really good way to explore theme. So when you're looking at it, it's like, okay, well, the emperor is taking these shards of bone from the people, and they are starting to get a little bit upset about that. And I feel like, there's real world parallels where we're, taking from the the people who are disadvantaged and, using that to power things that make us comfortable. So yeah, I feel like it's very, very central to the story and what's happening. I mean, it's in the title.
Then I'll go over to Marie.
Absolutely central for us in multiple ways at once, some of which would be absolute spoilers, so I won't go into those. But definitely a chunk of the plot conflicts that are driving the series ultimately tie in very closely with both Pattern and Numenatria. But it's also central in some more immediately obvious ways, because one of the things we knew going into the story was that we wanted Ren, our main character, to be a pattern reader, to be a Sorsa, because it just gave us some really interesting dimensions to play with in how she interacts with the people around her in the plot. And then Numenatria, because we have this cultural conflict between the Leganti colonizers and the Versenian local people, that is also tied in with the different kinds of magic that they practice and what gets respected, and how is Numenatria, for example, kind of like Andrea was saying, how is that used as part of their control over the city? And we just weave it into the societies in general. It's not a thing that exists over here and is kind of bolted onto the side. It's woven into their cultures and into their religions and into all kinds of aspects, so that it's very pervasive throughout the story, even when magic itself isn't happening.
And Gareth?
I wouldn't say it was central per se, but the lead character is running around with a sword called Spellbreaker, which is basically this ultimate anti-magic weapon. It can basically literally cut through spells, counter magic that affect him. So it more sort of once you have a character weapon and cut through magic, then magic will become part of the conflict because people will want him to cut through other people's spells, and he'll basically be this immovable object that magic can't affect. So I wasn't really thinking about the magic initially at all, but once I gave him that sword, it became progressively more important.
And then we'll close with you, Evan.
Yeah, I think that, like you were saying earlier, Bradley, about it's oftentimes magic can be really interesting when it really sort of affects the characters in the story and sort of really not dictates, but guides the way the narrative flows from the character perspective. I think that's what I was trying to do with the magic system in my series, and also kind of like what Andrea's saying is that the magic system is like a form of power. Like, I mean, that's maybe perhaps somewhat obvious to say, but a form of power like we might consider power in our society here, where it's a form of maybe, kind of like how infrastructure has power, how wealth creates power, how economies create power. And so it's about examining that and not using power the way we have it here, but examining power from another perspective, but still trying to understand how that would flow for the people in the story, given my understanding of how power ends up flowing for us in this world right now. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think, all of your thoughts on that and how it influences the world and the world building and the characters is also interesting. And I think that magic systems are much more than just cool magic and spells. It's so central to epic fantasy in a lot of ways. So I'm actually going to jump into the Q&A portion. As a reminder, if anyone else has a question in the chat, you can put it in the sidebar. There's a little question box, and you can enter your question there. And I'll start with this first one, which comes to us from Caitlin, which says, how can you develop a powerful magic system while avoiding the issue of why can't they magic the problem away? So how do you deal with too powerful of magic in your novels? And I'm going to start with you, Gareth, for this one.
Well, I mean, the simple answer is that you can't magic the problem away because they also have magic. So basically, presumably, if both sides have access to some form of supernatural power, then you can sort of set up like, okay, we just can't like, wave a wand and dispel the problem because there are countermeasures and wards and spells to stop that. The simple direct answer you got to. They can do it too.
And Andrea, how do you deal with too powerful of magic?
So the way I think of this is often the way I think about technology in a way, because we get these wonderful new technologies and it solves a lot of problems for us, but it also creates problems. So I don't necessarily, for me, like any kind of magic that you have coming into the world, it's like, oh, great, we have this bone shard magic. We can create these constructs to be in our armies. But at the same time, it's creating a problem because it is taking the life force of the people. So like what do we do with that? So yeah, I kind of look at it the way that I look at technology in the sense that it does create problems as well as solve them.
And Evan?
Yeah, kind of the same thing. I think I try to focus on the limits of the magic and also the costs of it. And I think with limits and costs are what create or what make it so that you can't do certain things. And so within the context of the story that's being told, when you understand the limits and the costs, it should hopefully feel pretty obvious while you're reading why something can or can't be done. And so, yeah, that's the hope anyway.
Emery and Alyssa, any additional thoughts?
I would say that with limits and costs, bear in mind that those aren't just part of the magic system, because I think that's where a lot of people's thoughts go to. But, with what I said before about making it part of the culture in the world, there might be laws that limit what you can do or punish you if you do something wrong. There might be religious beliefs that say, well, yeah, you could do that if you were a horrible blasphemer. There's going to be a lot of cultural expectations, even just down around to like the peer pressure level that people look at and say, but who would do something like that? And if you do, you're going to be ostracized. So yeah, don't just look to the magic system to limit the magic system. Look to the whole setting and the other aspects of the culture.
And I would add on to all of that, also imperfect knowledge, because oftentimes when a magic system feels thin to me, it's because everything about it is known and everybody knows everything and how to do stuff. And like science isn't like that. Even if you have a scientific magic system, there's like boundary, we know 1%, and there's boundaries beyond that. So treat your magic like that too. Both your character not necessarily knowing everything about it, but also the society in general. There's just more to explore and discover and learn about it. So yeah, and then also consider the depth of time that magic has happened, because as Andrea was saying, with technology, you're going to have people coming up with counters and counters. So that actually gives you some great world building opportunities to where you start from. What are the counters that have been developed over time?
Yeah, I love that. There's a lot of depth that you can give to it, and it adds the like exploratory nature that's both fun from a creative perspective for the author, but also from the reader perspective of, oh, we're sort of bumping up against the walls here, but then occasionally we break through them and find out something new. Great. So this comes to us from Maripin Vale, and they ask, magic in any fictional world would make a major difference in the culture and way of life. What kinds of questions or things should we think about when braiding the magic with our world? And I'll actually start with Marie and Alyssa for this one.
Okay, how much time do you have? To try and give a brief answer here, the thing that I will frequently look to is the religion, because we're talking about metaphysics. We're talking about stuff that goes beyond kind of the regular concrete reality of the characters. And that is something that religion often has quite a lot to say about. So for us, I think, for both of us, the magic is often tied in with the other beliefs the characters have about the cosmos that they live in and what it means to be a person living in that. Like, what's ethical, what's not ethical.
And I would add also thinking about the broken pieces that happen to occur in people's everyday lives. Like we have all sorts of folkloric practices that we don't even know necessarily the origin of, touching wood, things like that. Cats having 9 lives. Think about all of those ways that your magic can have broken off bits and pieces in people's everyday lives that they don't even know is necessarily associated with the magic. But your reader will realize.
And Andrea, how do you sort of thread magic into your world building?
I think a lot about who has it and what they use it for, because like we were talking about before, magic is a power structure. So how does that fit into their government, and how does that fit into their culture? And what do the people who have the magic, like what do they use it for, and what do they like tell themselves? Like, what is the story that they tell themselves about why they're using it and how they're using it?
And Evan, what about you?
Yeah, I'm just going to hop on a lot of that same stuff that everyone's been saying and say, yeah, the sociocultural effects that magic has. Try to think through all of that stuff. Like, it's maybe a small example, but it's one that I kind of like for this. In Avatar: The Last Airbender, the one with Korra, when Korra is the Avatar, so I guess the sequel kind of thing. The firebenders, there's people who can use fire. I think in one scene there that stuck with me, they're in like a coal plant or something, or on like a steamship, and they're powering the steamship with their fire magic, because you wouldn't necessarily shovel coal in there if you have people that can push magic out of their bodies, or push fire out of their bodies. So think about all the ways that the powers that the magic gives to your people, how that will change what they have, what they do have, what they don't have, and what they do and what they don't do.
Yeah, and Gareth, anything additional to add?
I'll give a worked example from the real world, which I found really, really handy for talk magic, which is the history of gunpowder. The one I recommend is this one by Jack Kelly, but there are loads of books on it. Well, basically, you've got the technology which starts off in China, slowly migrates to Europe, and the book there, it goes through all the various social and technological changes, and it just brought into like all the bizarre things, like the importance of bell making, because they were there to make the cannons, the importance of getting the right soil, which is why the British were so interested in India, because there's lots of saltpeter there. It's like it touched on so many things I hadn't thought about, and it's a great example of how you can take this, what seemed up as a supernatural power, be able to point and kill someone, and how that had ramifications through many different levels of society and culture. It just was a really interesting way of looking at that particular part of history, and basically substitute for gunpowder the ability to call lightning bolts or talk to animals or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like everyone's thoughts are it's just thinking through how it literally affects every facet of the world and the characters. And I like your example a lot, Evan, because I think then you add in sort of the human cost as well, and what does that mean for these people who can do magic? Very interesting. So the next question that we have comes from Annalise. How many times have you gotten super far into your writing and realized that you've had to retcon your magic system to fit a point, or something that you realized you didn't add before? I'm gonna guess this has never happened, but let's see if I'm wrong. And I'll start with you for this one, Gareth.
Many times. With the Sword Defiant, I initially started off. It's sort of conscious, like, it's a D&D campaign 20 years after it finished. It's like, 20 years ago the heroes killed the Dark Lord, and now it's how they live with things afterwards. So when I started writing it, I basically, had a wizard throwing fireballs, I had a cleric casting healing spells, all the standard D&D tropes. And then as I started developing the world more, I realized, hang on, I want to have what looks like the standard D&D things, but have a different underlying approach to them. I went back and edited stuff, but it's a lot easier if your main character isn't a wizard, because if your character is a wizard and needs to understand stuff, then you need to have a much deeper understanding of how the magic system works. In my case, my main character is, as I said, this not especially bright fighter. So I was able to just go back and change the descriptions and stuff, and he didn't know what was going on in there anyway. So that was all fine, but I was lucky, because if it didn't one about a wizard, I'd have been screwed.
Marie and Alice, how do you feel?
So this happened in two ways for us, one good and one, not bad, but more challenging, which is, so our main character, Ren, is a Sorsa. She reads patterns, but she was actually separated from her community at a fairly early age. And so she knows the basics, but she hasn't been trained up in the traditions the way a lot of people have. And that gave us the opportunity, because of this character, of that imperfect knowledge I was talking about before, so that we had a pretty good idea about, like, we knew what all the cards were, we knew like the basic layout and everything. But as the series progressed, we had other like avenues that we could open up in that we could introduce, because Ren was new to it. Like, she didn't know about it. And so as she learns about it, we learn about it. The other side of that was, about halfway through drafting the first book, we realized that astrology, which had kind of been sort of a tacked on thing to Numenatria, was going to be much more important than we originally realized. And so I had to kind of go back. Marie took point on pattern, I took point on Numenatria. I had to kind of go back and like develop an entire new branch of Numenatria. So that was fun.
But I would say that I think that when we made those changes, they don't necessarily even feel like changes, because at the outset, we had a strong grip on what's the core of this magic. Like, what are the fundamental symbols and how it works with them? And so that flexibility of interpretation was useful to us, but it didn't feel like we were having to staple on some kind of addition or something like that wasn't part of the core concept. So the more you have that firm grip on your foundation at the outset, the easier I think it is to roll with these changes and have them feel organic to the setting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Just building out from the whole of what you sort of developed and know to be sort of true to the magic system. Andrea, I'll go to you next.
Okay, so I got lucky with Bone Shard Daughter in that I didn't really have to make a lot of changes, but generally I kind of write the first draft off of vibes alone, and then I have to go back and like figure things out a little bit more. So I would say variable, although I have gotten to the point on like another book that I've written, and I had not figured out the magic system until I had written that first draft. So yeah, it depends on how rough that first draft is.
It's fine. It's all the discovery stage, so that's what it's there for. And Evan, we'll close this one with you.
Yeah, so I plot very, very heavily because I was like, oh, this is going to make the work easier and make me a much faster writer. It does not make me a much faster writer, but I still like doing it that way because I enjoy working that way. So I don't usually have to go back and like pull whole elements out because I plot through every single scene before I start even writing the draft. But what does happen is as I'm writing the draft, it's like when you're plotting, it's like you're looking at it from a top down, very high up view. When you're in the draft, you're in the characters' heads, you're in the world, you're in the scene. And so then things will come up where the character will be like, oh, I would just use my magic to do this to solve this problem. And I'm like, no, do not do that because that breaks stuff. And so then I have to go back and sort of try to better understand the magic system for myself. So from the plotting stage, I get all the sort of the bare bones, and I think I've got a very solid grasp on it. But when I'm actually in the draft, you start to see things differently because you're seeing things on the ground, kind of like in the campaign on the ground. And then that's, I think, what for me revising and editing is for. Like I go back in and I understand things better now because I've been to the draft. So then I can say, well, that wasn't how it was supposed to be. It's supposed to be like this, and I massage and I touch up and I fix.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the next one that we have, and Alyssa, you touched on this a little bit with your main character, but it's how do you balance conveying to the reader how a magic system works with the realistic understanding a character would have with how the magic system works. So this kind of goes back to the sort of information that you as the author have, and information that the characters have, and information on the magic system, and sort of information that you then give to the readers. So I'll start with Andrea for this one. How do you balance sort of who knows what and when?
I actually draw these terrible diagrams. That kind of like, I'm like, what do I know? And what do they know? And like, when do they figure this out? So I take a bunch of really terrible, messy notes about what the characters know, what their understanding of what's going on in the world and how the magic works versus what is actually happening. And then also I note down like when they realize these certain things about how the magic actually works, because that generally has a bearing on the plot. So that's kind of how I handle it, which I don't know if I would recommend.
Marie and Alice, I'll get to you next.
To some extent, I feel like this is a question of point of view because in some kinds of stories, why does the reader need to know more than the character does about how the magic works? It can actually throw me out of a story when I feel like we've left the point of view of our character for the author to explain this to me. And I think that there's a lot to be said for being willing to go with, I don't quite know the limits and the powers of this kind of thing. I'm just going to roll with what the character discovers or experiences as they do it. I think that, the reader wants to know, but the reader doesn't always get what they want.
And I think you can kind of balance that with, especially if you have a multi-POV or you have a character in conversation with other characters, you can feed more information that way. Either two characters have imperfect knowledge that overlaps or that contradicts each other, because that is really where you get into the fun things. When two people know something that contradicts each other, then you've got to figure out, okay, well, what's the thing that unifies that makes it not contradictory anymore? So you can have a lot of fun with that.
And Evan.
Yeah, this is a really good question because I struggle with this in the sense that I enjoy stories where it feels as if the conversations the characters are having are extremely real. But extremely real conversations, if you are not a part of that group, that culture, that knowledge base, it's like the people are speaking in a different language because they speak with shorthand, they speak with assumptions and biases built into the conversation so that you just will not have any clue what's being said. But then we as the reader are reading this, right? And we're reading this thing that's happening between characters who should know so much more about their world, their culture, their politics, their religious aspects, all that stuff than we do. And if they were speaking in a truly natural way, it would be almost incomprehensible to us, the reader, I think. So it's a struggle to try and be as natural and as real as possible because that appeals to me, while still being able to make each scene, each moment, each story comprehensible to somebody else.
And Gareth, how do you manage the flow of information?
Yeah, I mean, it's more sort of a general question, like, how do you convey to the reader any sort of like, complicated technical thing they need to understand for the plot. Like if you're doing a book set in a courtroom, they need to like explain various intricacies of the law. If you're doing like a book about the military, you've got to like explain various terms. I guess the thing to boil down is what does the reader actually need to know versus what the character can talk about? Because like you can have characters who babble about stuff if it's not plot relevant, and as long as you can sort of signal to the reader that this is just flavor, this is not going to impact the plot later on, you can get away with that. The other thing is, I'm a huge believer in just enthusiastic exposition. There's a fantastic sidebar which I keep recommending in these panels, in Jeff Andrea's Wonder Book, but where Kim Stanley Robinson, the Mars books. The Mars books are science fiction, and he will spend a whole chapter on like the soil chemistry of Mars, and it is like there may be some like sort of like absolute minor report characters say tell me the soil chemistry, and it's all report speech, but it's weird him showing how enthusiastic he is about Mars, and he's so enthusiastic that makes the reader care too. So like I'm very cautious to say like don't drop in massive chunks of exposition, because if you really care about it and you can make the reader care about it, then it's fine. You can get away with putting lots of nonsense. I mean, Tolkien put in endless pages of backstory, and I will read Tolkien over and over and over. But that's just me.
It's a pretty bold,
technically heresy.
It's a pretty bold statement to say to an editor. I'm just dropping in a lot of enthusiastic information here, but well, if it's you're a fantastic writer, so you can get away with it. Okay, so we have a couple of minutes left, and I think this is an interesting one to close on. We'll do a couple more if we have time. But this comes from Malcolm, who says, how important is it to develop and flesh out the magic system, even when it will not be fully explained or actualized until later books in the series and universe? And we've touched on that a little bit, but I like that here because obviously, like everyone is saying, sort of new things pop up as you're working through the plot. But when you go into a book, when do you sort of feel confident going, all right, I've got the magic system at a point that I can start writing this thing? And I'll start with Evan on this one.
Okay, yeah, that's another great question. And I think that for me, whether it's magic or any other plot points, I'll start with my own biases. I like books or any sort of storytelling that is very sort of taut. Like it's like a really tight string, so it drags me along at full speed, kind of. But that's what I really enjoy, and that's what I'm about. And so when there's something like I'm losing my train of thought here, though. I got so into that sort of tight string kind of analogy there. But no, sorry, Brad, could you ask the question again? Because I really I said myself.
Yeah, it's just how much do you need to develop the magic system before you feel confident starting the actual novel? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't need to develop it. Well, I like to develop it a lot, actually. So I do need to know a lot, but I don't think you need to tell the readers a lot. And I think that the other panelists have been talking about that. And when I say there's sort of the tight string analogy thing again, it's because I like when I'm only given what I need to know to keep the story moving forward, to keep the stakes clear to me, to keep the characters' needs, wants, goals, aspirations clear to me. And if I'm given just that stuff, and as we go through the story, it opens up more and more because I learn who these people are more and more. I learn what the world is more and more, but only give me what I need in that moment, because then the story can keep moving as fast as possible for a reader like me, and it'll open up when it opens up, and I'll just be dragged right into it along the way. That's what I enjoy.
Yeah, I like that. All just keeping the plot sort of tightly paced and on the train tracks. Gareth, I'll go over to you next. How much do you develop a magic system before you start drafting?
I'll normally have either a couple of restrictions or a couple of sort of thematic things the system has to do. That like for example, in sort of the Star Magic system is all about sort of working as a fate and controlling people and channeling redirecting existing forces, and it can't do certain things. But I also find I write very, very well with having to write around constraints and like write around my own past ideas. So I won't bother developing. I won't sort of sit there and think, okay, I've said this magic in book 1. How will that impact book 3? Because by the time I'm doing back book 3, my ideas might have changed, but I'll have those restrictions from book 1, and I'll have better ideas writing around them. Because the thing about magic is, it's this like if you just say it's magic, it's this sort of horrible get out of jail free card. You can feel like, I can make anything happen. You don't want to make anything happen. You want to basically sort of constrain the story down to what has to happen. So basically, throwing stones in your own path in earlier books works very well for me. So build obstacles myself and then have to write around them, as opposed to just going, and then magic saves the day. If that makes sense.
No, that definitely makes sense. And Andrea, what about you?
So I believe I have it all really well planned out by the time that I start writing, and then I generally discover that is not the case. So yeah, usually, well, I mean, all the time, basically, I know exactly what the magic system is by the time the book is like going to print, because for me personally, I really like to build in those like little reveals and the things that the characters discover throughout the second and the third books. So I have to know by the time the first book is ready to go to print exactly what the magic system is. But I generally find that I'm discovering a little bit throughout the process of writing the first book.
And Marie and Ellis?
I think, yeah, a lot of this just comes down to your comfort level for how much you plan and how much you just fly by the seat of your pants. In the same way that's true for other aspects of the setting or your protagonist's backstory or your plot. I mean, how much do you need to know where you're going with those things in the long term versus, in order to be able to do the early part of it? A lot of that's just going to vary from person to person. And, if you're more willing to do the thing where you write a really rough first draft, or if that's just what your process requires, then, you don't have to know anything and you just kind of wing it as you go. But I also think it depends a little bit on the type of story for the Rook and Rose books because of how much there is intricate intrigue and ancient kind of bits of history being uncovered. We had to know a lot more of it going in than either of us tends to know when we're working on different kinds of stories or working separately.
And I will say, if you're feeling nervous and you're looking for guidelines, the questions that Bradley had at the beginning of the session for us were really good ones. What are the limits? Where does the power come from? Who can do it? Like, those questions were really great, just to know those answers to those questions, and you can kind of build out from there.
Awesome, thank you. So we're coming up on our hour mark. So unfortunately, this has been not unfortunately, that's been great. This has been great. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up here. But thank you all so much for joining us today, and thank you to the authors for jumping in and chatting with us about magic systems. This is really interesting, and I hope everyone got some great takeaways from the conversation. So as I said at the beginning, the green button at the bottom will link you to all of these wonderful authors' books, and it will also link you to the other sessions that we have. So feel free to jump in and explore all of the other things that we have going on in our How to Write Your First SFF novel. And with that said, we'll all just wave goodbye. Thanks again, everybody.